The Russia-Ukraine war continues with victories and defeats in the shadow of explosions and clashes. Many developments in the air, on land, and at sea affect the course of the war. But what about the developments outside the war zones? Can the statements made by unarmed and uncamouflaged people far away from explosions and clashes affect the course of the war? Yes, some statements are as effective as missiles blowing up the most important headquarters. In particular, the statements and confessions of those who have witnessed the events on the battlefield can have the power of discrediting countries and armies. A statement made the other day destroyed the diminishing reputation of the Russian army. Andrei Medvedev, who served as a commander with the Wagner Group, a private military company but resigned from his post due to lawlessness and corruption, made a striking statement the other day. Medvedev left the Wagner Group in late July 2022 and defected from Russia in January 2023, seeking asylum in Norway. Medvedev's statements drop like a bomb on Russia's agenda. Former Wagner Group official Andrei Medvedev made statements to an American media organization. Medvedev announced that Russian soldiers who refused to serve in the occupied territories were killed. Medvedev said that soldiers who did not want to fight against Ukraine were shot and thrown into graves in front of the eyes of the soldiers who had just joined the front. The Russian military may be ruthlessly trying to solve its problems, such as the lack of military personnel to serve in the occupied territories. The many soldiers leaving the front are surrendering to Ukrainian troops and the increasing casualties, as Medvedev says. Because before this statement of Medvedev, the statements of Russian soldiers who were captured by Ukraine or surrendered to the Ukrainian troops and left the front describing the atrocities in the Russian army came to the fore. The phone calls of Russian soldiers serving in Ukraine were leaked recently. The most striking of these conversations was what a Russian soldier named Sergei said while talking to his girlfriend. Sergei said that Russian army ordered the soldiers to kill hundreds of civilians in the city of Bucha. Sergei told his girlfriend, "They told us that there were a lot of civilians walking around where we were going, and they ordered us to kill everyone we saw." In total, Ukrainian intelligence intercepted 22 phone calls revealing that the inhuman orders and practices of the Russian army were criticized by soldiers within the army. The handful of Russian soldiers held by the Russian army are kept in the army with threats. One thing is constantly on their minds: to leave the front line or surrender to Ukrainian troops. Russian soldiers are waiting for the right moment to make this happen. In recent months, a media outlet reported that Russian soldiers had injured themselves in order to escape the war. The soldiers' statements confirm this claim. In one of the leaked phone calls, a Russian air assault soldier says to his girlfriend, "I had a commander who shot himself in the leg just to get out of here." Soldiers who were able to escape from the Russian army continue to report the inhuman practices of the army in their statements. One of them is Nikita Chibrin, who escaped from the Russian occupiers and fled to Europe via Belarus and Kazakhstan. Describing the brutality within the Russian army, Chibrin says that in the 64th Separate Guards Motorized Rifle Brigade where he served, there were maniacs who enjoyed killing people and rapes. Chibrin also said that Russian invaders broke into homes of Ukrainian civilians and looted items such as jewelry, computers, and phones. He said the occupiers sold the stolen items in Belarus. Many soldiers serving in the Russian army say it is not right to fight Ukraine. They say that Russian soldiers are unaware of the operations they are carrying out, and the reason they are in Russian paratrooper commando. Pavel Filatyev, who questioned all these and published his thoughts in a 141-page book, reveals almost all the crimes of the Russian army in his writings. Filatyev explained that the reason for writing these confessions as follows: "I am not afraid to fight in war, but I need to feel justice to realize that what I did was right. And I believe that all this is failing not only because the government is stealing everything, but because the Russians don't feel that what we are doing is right. Why do we need this war? And I really thought, God, if I survive, I will do everything in my power to stop this." Pavel Filatyev was wounded in the eye by a shell explosion and left the army saying that he could not fight like that. Filatyev, who left Russia immediately after leaving the Russian army, began to describe all the barbarities he witnessed during the war. Filatyev also described the difficult conditions Russian soldiers were living in. He said that the authorities in the army did not care about the hardships of Russian soldiers. Filatyev said that he could bathe only once for 2 months and did not eat bread for a month and a half. Filatyev also made striking statements about the equipment in the Russian army. It has long been stated that the equipment destroyed in the war cells was leftover from the Soviet-Russian era and was insufficient against the Ukrainian army. Filatyev talked about a development he experienced on this issue. He said that when Russia launched its invasion attempt in Ukraine, weapons were distributed to the soldiers in the army. However, he stated that these weapons were rusted and a strap was broken. Filatov's writings revealed many facts that the Russian army is trying to conceal and the inhumanity of its actions in the war zones. In a report containing the statements of soldiers who surrendered to Ukrainian troops or escaped from the front, a Russian soldier openly expressed all the inhuman acts he committed in the war. Here are the confessions of the Russian occupier. I, Daniel Andreevich Fokin of the Guard Corps, a soldier of Military Unit 5460, confessed to all the crimes are committed in Andreevka: shooting civilians, stealing from civilians, and taking their phones. Then our fighters, all the infantry fighting on the front line. While the Russian army is suffering a setback on the front line with the losses it suffered against Ukraine, it is also losing credibility with the confessions of Russian soldiers who surrendered after these confessions. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is seen as a ruthless person by the whole world. Putin is aware of all the developments confessed by the surrendered soldiers, but he ignores them because Putin cannot even find soldiers to fight. Almost all the soldiers in the Russian army do not want to take part in the invasion of Ukraine. Therefore, Putin, who cannot find soldiers, mostly deploys mercenaries belonging to the Wagner Group and Chechens loyal to Kadyrov in the occupation zones. This means that untrained and ruthless people are being deployed on the front lines. The atrocities committed by the Wagner Group during the occupation are known to the whole world. Last week, the United States declared the Wagner Group an international criminal organization. This company is headed by Yevgeny Prigozhin, one of the closest friends of Russian leader Putin. The whole world sees Putin and his friend as wrong. It is predicted that Russia will have big problems even if the war ends with dwindling ammunition, surrendered soldiers, and declining reputation. The Russian army tried to organize an offensive against the city of Soledar. However, despite prolonged efforts, they failed to capture Soledar. So on Yevgeny Prigozhin's orders, Wagner contract soldiers were involved in this offensive. Many Wagner soldiers were sent to the area to support the Russian troops in Soledar. With the participation of Wagner soldiers, the Ukrainian army was forced to retreat, and Soledar was occupied by the Russian army. Now Vladimir Putin aims to use the same tactic for the city of Bakhmut. The Russian army has been trying to capture Bakhmut for a long time, but has not yet achieved the desired success. After Ukrainian officials announced that the Russian army was suffering more than 600 casualties per day on Ukrainian territory, Vladimir Putin decided to send more troops to the Bakhmut front to intervene in this situation. However, these soldiers sent by Putin rebelled and decided to join the Ukrainian army. The commander of Russia's troops stationed at Soledar in Ukraine on the orders of Russia's chief of staff has started directing Russian troops at the headquarters to the back controlled approximately 400 Russian soldiers, with 16 armored vehicles set up for the journey heading towards the Bakhmut front. However, 7 vehicles behind the convoy suddenly changed their route and left the convoy. This unexpected maneuver surprised the high-ranking Russian commander who was leading the convoy. However, another Russian commander and his subordinates were also present in the departing vehicles. The Russian convoy was heading in the direction of Bakhmut when 7 vehicles suddenly changed course and headed towards the Dnipro, the center of the Ukrainian army. The commander of the Russian contingent did not fully understand the events, but realized that Russian commanders and soldiers had left the convoy in a show of rebellion. The separated soldiers managed to reach the city of Dnipro after hours of traveling. The Russian soldiers got out of the vehicles with their hands in the air, waved a white flag, and surrendered to the Ukrainian army. Initially, Ukrainian soldiers did not approach the Russian soldiers, considering this a trap. However, after waiting for a while, Ukrainian soldiers captured the Russian soldiers and handed them over to the main headquarters. The statements of the Russian commander, who was then interrogated by the Ukrainian commanders, surprised everyone. The Russian commander admitted that most of the soldiers under his command were forcibly recruited into the army and had no combat experience. He said that these soldiers were sent by Putin to die on Ukrainian soil and that they wanted to surrender to the Ukrainian army to save their lives. The Russian commander also said that in many Russian headquarters, the soldiers have started to mutiny and their basic needs are not being met. The commander also said that they did not want to die for Putin's own interests and had been looking for a way out of the war for a long time. The commander admitted that they abandoned the convoy and fled when they left headquarters and were directed to Bakhmut, and said that it was a more logical choice for Putin to fight with the Ukrainian army instead of dying. Russian troops who have been occupying Ukrainian territory for a long time are heavily struggling with the negative effects of the war. The Russian army has been trying to better manage and organize its troops by establishing headquarters in the regions it captured in Ukraine. However, recently there have been increasing reports that Russian soldiers who have settled in these headquarters have a tendency to rebel and disobey orders. In recent months, Russian leader Vladimir Putin has declared partial mobilization across the country. With this decision, the Russian public's reaction to Putin has changed dramatically. Forced into war, Russian citizens have become increasingly angry, and this has turned into a growing social backlash against Putin. Initially, Putin downplayed this reaction, but over time, public anger began to undermine his authority. From the beginning of the war, protests against Putin and the war were organized in many Russian cities. Almost every day, Russian citizens gather in front of the Kremlin palace and call on Putin to stop the war. These protests were not limited to Russia and to Putin, and anti-war protests were also organized in many foreign countries. Protests of various sizes were organized in many countries such as Germany, France, Canada, Poland, and Turkey. But despite all this pressure, Putin remains determined to continue the occupation of Ukraine. As the protests in Russia increased, Putin tried to suppress the people by deploying security forces. According to independent news sources, more than 20,000 citizens have been detained. However, despite all these developments, Putin is not willing to end his occupation of Ukraine. As opposition officials in Russia began to take steps against Putin, Putin's anxiety is growing, driven by the fear of a coup. Putin is making efforts to eliminate all threats against him, as it is known since the beginning of the war. 11 oligarchs known as the richest people in Russia have died in a strange way. While some oligarchs died by falling out of windows, others were found dead in their homes. The deaths of 11 Russian oligarchs remain a question mark, and the Russian government is refraining from making a statement on the matter. Putin is trying to manipulate the Russian people, worried about the outbreak of a major uprising across the country through the Russian media, which he controls. He disseminates manipulative news, publicizing many reports that the war in Ukraine has ended in a victory for the Russian army. It is known that it is currently forbidden in Russia to publish any news that is against the war and criticizes the Russian army. At the beginning of the war, some Russian television channels had broadcast news, emphasizing that the war was not right. However, Putin imposed very heavy fines on these TV channels and prevented any TV channel in Russia from broadcasting anti-war news. The Russian public is very uncomfortable with this situation. Russian citizens who want to access real information about the war in Ukraine have started to prefer independent news sites on the internet instead of television channels. As it is known, Russian leader Vladimir Putin refrains from disclosing the losses of the Russian army on Ukrainian territory, although every month the Ukrainian government provides updated data. Putin refrains from disclosing this information on the grounds that it is a state secret. Putin, who is worried about the public reaction due to the huge losses of the Russian army, is trying to appease the public anger by refraining from disclosing the data from the streets. For this reason, the Russian people are trying to learn what is happening by turning to internet news. However, Putin has started to block access to many websites in Russia to find a solution to the situation. It is estimated that more than 250,000 websites have been blocked in Russia since the beginning of the war. On the southern front line, the Zaporizhia region is among the places where the conflicts are most intense. Russian forces are trying to hold temporarily occupied territories. The Russians focus their efforts on attempts to disrupt the active actions of the Ukrainian army in certain directions. Russian forces are firing at Ukrainian positions throughout the line of contact, conducting remote mining operations and conducting aerial reconnaissance. At the same time, Russian troops continue to attack civilian infrastructure and residential areas in violation of international humanitarian law and the laws of war. But Ukraine does not remain silent to the attempts of the Russian army to attack. The anticipated retaliation comes without delay. Ukrainian forces dealt a heavy blow to Russian troops near Tokmak city of Zaporizhia region. The Ukrainian Air Force destroyed the S-300 missile system, one of the most effective air defense systems of the Russian army in cooperation with artillery units. Unfortunately, the Russian S-300 losses were not limited to this much. An S-300 air defense system battery was also destroyed near Zelina Topinka. Zelina Tropic is located in Ukraine's Kherson Oblast, one of the southernmost regions of the country. The region is located just north of the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia annexed from Ukraine in 2014. The Ukrainian army released a video. The Kiev army claimed that the video showed the destruction of a Russian air defense battery in southern Ukraine. The video was first shared on the official Facebook page by the Southern Operational Command Formation of the Ukrainian Army. The video shows a lot of burnt and smoking wreckage that looks like some kind of truck. The post claimed that targets were a battery of S-300 surface-to-air missile systems operated by Russian forces. The Russian forces, who wanted to achieve an important success on the southern front line, were shot in the heart in two regions. The cost of Russia's S-300 air defense system is exactly $115 million, not only in terms of financing, but also in the field of air dominance. Russia has lost a lot of credibility with these attacks. The fashion of the S-300 is lost to history, but on paper, the Russian army has the best arsenal against airstrikes. One of the batteries of multi-layer surface-to-air missiles capable of detecting and destroying the best-known systems aircraft and ballistics is the S-300. What is the S-300 air defense system? What do we know about the S-300? Let's explore these questions together. The S-300 is a surface-to-air missile system first introduced by the Soviet Union. Both Moscow and Kiev have used the S-300 during their current conflict, but the system had already seen significant service before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. A workhorse of Soviet and Russian air defense, the system is considered Russia's closest counterpart to the U.S. Patriot air and missile defense system. The various elements of the S-300 include a long-range surveillance, radar engagement, radar and launch vehicles, as well as a command vehicle capable of controlling the entire S-300 battery. In addition, this air defense system fires cruise missiles from a distance of more than 300 kilometers and up to a very high altitude. The neutralization of the Russian S-300s by the Ukrainians was one of the important factors affecting the course of the war. On the other hand, Russia wants to launch the S-400, a planned successor of the S-300. But questions about the new system's battlefield capabilities may complicate this effort. Therefore, the system will likely reach the 50th anniversary of battlefield use. Russian leader Vladimir Putin doesn't care if the Russian S-300 air defense system is devalued in addition to a series of failures on the front lines. Vladimir Putin continues to lose credibility with his army and missiles, which he trusts very much. But the Russian leader continues to struggle to gain gains on the front lines. As we mentioned at the beginning of the video, the Ukrainian war also hosts violent clashes on the eastern front lines. We are now diverting our course to the eastern front. The Bakhmut struggle has this front line in its grip. The Ukrainian army continues to put up a fierce defense along the entire contact line, despite constant Russian pressure. Bakhmut remains in Ukrainian hands. Russian Wagner Group fighters were inside the city but failed to encircle or drive out the Ukrainian defenders in the Bakhmut region. Russian troops carried out 187 attacks using barrels and rocket artillery. In the past day, 28 clashes were recorded in this region in one day. According to Sergei Sharavathy, spokesperson of the Eastern Group of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, 100 Russian soldiers were eliminated at the end of the conflict. Russian forces continue to lose in the fields and cities of Ukraine, especially with the recent losses in Bakhmut. This small city became the cemetery of the Russian private military company Wagner Group, which lost 20,000 to 30,000 soldiers in the months-long war. During the day, the Ukrainian Defense Forces destroyed the Russian BTR-80 armored personnel carrier IF Vityol-Pan self-propelled mortar for 123 mm, mortars, Strig electronic warfare station, and an ammunition depot. Also, according to Sharavathy, the situation in this region remains difficult, but sometimes the effectiveness of Russian forces wanes. This may be related to Russian intentions to regroup or change tactics in other areas. For example, the Russians previously employed battalion and company tactical groups. Now the Russian troops have switched to small-scale operations tactics, partly due to the sluggish advance at Bakhmut. The Russian army shifted some of its offensive weight elsewhere on the battlefield, particularly Avdiivka, Volodar, Kremenna, and Kupiansk. At the same time, the Ukrainians are preparing to launch their own large-scale offensive operations somewhere on the battlefield. Kiev signaled that its counterattack would take place in late spring or early summer. As a result, the Ukraine war does not seem to have an end. For now, both countries are trying to gather their forces for counterattacks. According to Russian media reports, the Russian Ministry of Defense is likely preparing for a major recruitment campaign. The aim will be to recruit 400,000 professional soldiers, which will be different from the reserve mobilization the Kremlin has ordered in the past. Rebuilding Russia's combat power in Ukraine, on the other hand, will require more personnel. Russia needs more ammunition and military equipment than it currently has. However, there is currently a significant shortage of modern weapons systems and ammunition in Russia, and any new troops will have to make do with obsolete systems such as the World War II designs that the Kremlin is currently sending to the front lines. Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine is about to turn into a complete historical disaster. Both the loss of the S-300 air systems and a series of failures on the front lines are destroying the war strategies of the Russian leader.